Hello and welcome to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez welcoming you to our leadership podcast series. And today we've hit our milestone in that we are recording today our 10th episode in the Emerging Leader podcast series. So I'd like to welcome our next guest by way of introduction. She has completed her PhD studies through the University of Southern Queensland. She has also worked in the University of Queensland as a learning advisor. And can I welcome to the podcast today, Caitlin Vayro. How are you, Caitlin?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Good, mate. Thank you for joining me today. Look, the Emerging Leader podcast is something that I've wanted to do for a long time, and thanks to the Evoca Ag program that's happening, the Future Young Leaders program that's been in effect now for 2 years, and you're part of the 2020 finalists. This is where I sourced your contact details and reached out to you to your podcast. I'm very grateful for the very professional layout of the AgriFutures website there that gives you a bit of an insight into who are our young leaders, particularly in the ag sector. And so this is a key reason I reached out to you, mate. So look, thank you for joining us today. Can I ask you to maybe share with the listeners what motivated you to do the PhD that you did?
Yeah, so it really stemmed from my experiences in undergrad, I guess, in consideration of, my past and background. So I personally grew up between Brisbane and the Gold Coast, but on my father's side of the family, it was, agriculture. He grew up on a farm. My great uncle had a farm. And so, I remember going there as a kid, absolutely loving it, playing with all the animals, that sort of thing. And then it's, just been in the back of my mind. And then when I was going through undergrad, there was in the program, I don't recall anything being brought up about, rural and remote areas. And given how vast Australia is and how many different rural and remote areas we have, I guess I was curious as to why it wasn't mentioned. And then I did my own digging and found out that there is some real issues around mental health and health in rural and remote areas, and then kind of just progressively explored that further and then settled on my research topic.
Oh, that's great. And so you saw a need to look at into the mental health space, and for those listening, working in the commercial seafood industry, I can understand the need to do more research in this, and particularly targeted research, because one of the things that has been made apparent to myself in my time trying to get skilled up in understanding what mental ill health actually really means on the ground is that a lot of research has been done and continues to need to happen, but we also need to be focusing down the track on what are the barriers that stop people from seeking help, which is where I think your PhD went to looking at what those barriers were.
Yeah. So it looked at the barriers and the facilitators. There was a lot less facilitators though, because my project originally, when very first conceptualized, was actually going to be very different. It was going to look at introducing like e-mental health services in farming communities. But when I then delved deeper, given it was a new research topic for me, I realized that the very little information we had was that farmers weren't seeking help, and there was disjointed aspects of addressing some reasons why, but not a kind of so I went inductive. I said, okay, why, and asked a bunch of questions through an interview. So that was kind of the purpose, trying to get that broader look at why farmers wouldn't seek help, or why primary producers, more accurately, wouldn't seek help.
Okay, sure. And that's a nice segue into the questions I've got around leadership for you. So as part of the Future Young Leaders program, obviously you've been identified as an emerging leader in the ag sector, which is great to see. I wish we could do this more in the seafood sector, and I'm sure we'll get there one day. So I might open up the questions here, Caitlin, if it's okay, by asking what do you see as your leadership role, and why have you taken that on? And that can not just mean in your studies, but in other walks of your life. Why why leadership? What's drawn you to that as a thing to be focused on?
Since you reached out, I've given this a lot of thought, and what I kind of came down to is that it wasn't so much leadership as I saw a need that needed to be addressed, and so far it hasn't, so why not me? So in that kind of way I conceptualize it, it stems from the research. I put a lot of hard work and a lot of, blood, sweat and tears into that project. So now it's about really getting it out there, because the information I've learned can be useful, and I want people to know that. I want people to know what I've learned so they can apply it. There's a lot of kind of movement towards those real grassroots, mental health efforts. So it's, here's some evidence that you can use with your community-based, programs and that, events, that sort of thing, to try and really have that impact. So, thinking about the PhD as an original contribution to knowledge, it's something new. So here's my something new that I'd love to share with other people.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And that to me opens up a discussion that's not been had a lot in any of the podcasts around leadership. Doesn't necessarily have to happen in an organizational context. And what I'm hearing from you, and I can understand now why you're part of the program you are a part of, is that you've taken a leadership role by wanting to take this out to the world and saying, hey, I've done something here and I need to share those findings with you. And I think you picked a good topic, because it is one that is ongoing, and there's always that stigma around talking around mental ill health, and we need more people invested in this area, not less. And so I can see why you're part of that program from a leadership perspective. It's not necessarily one that's within an organizational context, if you get my meaning.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about it, and to get the references in there, I liken it. The way I feel about my leadership is I feel like I'm a calf who's, still just been born. So I'm struggling to find my feet a little bit, but I'm keen and I'm going to find my balance. And then, I don't have a lot of experience, but I'll get there, and, I will become the, great producing dairy cattle or something. I don't know. I'm finding my feet, I think, is a good way to kind of explain my views on leadership, especially, having my project kind of, my background's in the psych and the health, but then kind of it has that applicability to agriculture, but kind of, I guess, straddling the two worlds can, be a little bit strange, but I'm learning as I go.
And that's fine. We all have to start somewhere. I mean, come being fresh out of university, the opportunities will come thick and fast. It's just a matter of getting that knowledge out there. And again, what you've done to do that with the first step with the Future Leaders program is one way to do that. And hopefully when people are listening to this podcast, they can hear what I'm hearing as that I'm talking to someone who's passionate about a topic that is of relevance to real people, and it has real consequences if it's not engaged with. So you've thrown me a bit of a curveball here, Caitlin, and I think I'm going to and it's fine, because I think we can work with this particular podcast around looking at leadership around maybe the studies that you did, and again with because you've obviously gone through undergrad and postgraduate studies to get to where you've got to. So if I can ask the following, using that as a context, if it helps, from your experience, what were the most critical leader capabilities that you saw in those that were more senior to you or in a supervisory capacity? What were the leader capabilities that you saw coming out that were important to you?
Capabilities wise, absolutely collaboration, communication, strategic thinking, and critical thinking would be my top four. So I'm thinking particularly of one of my advisors who is absolutely incredible. Very, very strong leadership, very collaborative, works with all sorts of people, great communication skills, very clear, very direct, and strategic thinking was absolutely, she had it down. So it was, thinking, what do I need to do? Who, do I need to collaborate with? how do I need to make this point? She had all of that, down pat really well. And then critical thinking. So that's one, I guess, is also something another kind of passion area of mine is critical thinking, because there's leaders who can be, charismatic and everyone wants to follow them, but is it something worth following is a question that I always like to ask.
And that's great. And in fact, you've answered my next set of questions around some of the core leader capabilities that you see as important. And you've mentioned, and I want to unpack this a little bit if I can. Communication is becoming more and more important for me as someone who is a early career researcher in as much as I'm still haven't finished my bit of study, and so I defer to your knowledge as the graduated PhD here in this conversation. But for me, communications has come up a lot in the podcast, and a shameless plug here, I've got a survey out looking at what are some of the key critical leadership issues that are coming up. And one of the emerging ones that has come up and has got a lot of votes, as in this is one that future leaders need to get more engaged with, is communications. Now, communications being a multi-level, multifaceted thing that we're talking about here. So and again, using the framework that you've thrown up today, which is a great one around study, is communication from those that you saw as your either mentors or acting as your supervisors versus communication when you're out speaking to farmers and getting on the ground. That do you think you would have gotten to where you'd gotten to in your studies without open, free-flowing communication and clarity in that communication, if I can be so bold?
Oh, absolutely not. So, funnily enough, communication was a reasonable area of struggle for me, but I really do feel that the PhD really did help me with that. And there's still areas I absolutely need to work on, and I am well aware of that, but different skills were needed for different aspects. So, for example, when I was doing the interviews that I did with farmers for my first study, that was a lot of open communication, listening skills, good questions, that sort of thing. So there was that aspect, and that, when you actively thought about, is not too difficult. Then there's the getting your point across and how you frame things. And I think that can be very difficult in that it depends on your audience, and both written and speaking. So how you go and frame a talk for farmers is very different to how you frame a talk at a conference with other, mental health workers, mental health researchers, psychiatrists, doctors, that sort of thing.
That's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up, because I guess with a farming audience, and I'm really curious to ask this particular question, because amongst the commercial seafood industry, their how do I say this politely? Their BS radar is quite attuned, and I'm guessing with the farmers as well, that they expected a genuineness and openness about your communication that didn't leave them thinking you had an ulterior motive when you were talking to them. Is that a good guesstimate around how they would interact with you?
I'd say so. So I guess I went in very genuine. I'm not really about, hamming things up. I got, a reasonably good reception because, if you can't tell, I'm very passionate about the area anyway. The thing I noticed with farmers is, the terms that I use, I did have to really make sure that I left my psychobabble at the door.
Right. Yep. Okay. Yep.
What it came down to for me was providing a lot of examples and that explanation so that they understood what I was talking about when I was talking about the things I was.
Yeah. No. That's in those contexts, being able to speak in plain English often helps a lot, because we all have our technical jargon, and I find myself often using acronyms with people, and they just sort of look at you quite blankly, and you think, well, don't you know what I know? And you just make assumptions about things. So no, I I appreciate the chat around communication because it keeps coming up as a critical skill set. So whether you're out researching or dealing with a supervisor in an organizational context, trying to get people to follow your lead on a particular issue, if you can't communicate what it is you want to do, there is no outcome because people don't understand where you're coming from. So now I get that. So look, let me bring something else up in terms of, again, using the context of your studies. In terms of an emerging leader versus established leaders, and I'm guessing I'm using the framework here that you as a newly graduated PhD or someone who was recently studying and getting her credentials ready to go versus those who had those established credentials. What do you think you as an early career researcher brings to the table that established researchers might not?
Well, I guess going back to the, fundamentals of what a PhD is, it's still an original contribution in some way. So you bring new knowledge in having completed the degree. But when you look, I guess, more broadly, so in my role as a learning advisor, I worked with a team that was quite diverse. So the majority of the team did have PhDs, but in very, very different areas. So there was a physicist, a plant scientist, an ancient historian, and then we also had a couple of educated, like people with, masters in education. So quite diverse. And I remember having a discussion, we had lots of discussions about good scholarship and those sorts of things. And one thing that came up was that it's quite, well known that, across different fields, often major breakthroughs will happen when, one of the big thought leaders retires, because there's been, so kind of a focus on that while they're prolific in their field, and then as they retire, new people move in, and there can be some amazing new discoveries because of the new people coming in.
Yeah, and that makes some sense, I guess, in the context of university and trying to develop as much new knowledge as you can whilst trying to help people on the ground. And that's what interested me in your PhD studies, in that it didn't seem to me like it was just a theoretical piece of work. It was, you genuinely went out and talked to people about what it is were some of the barriers for them seeking help to potentially deal with mental ill health. So look, and again, and this is the next set of questions for me is around your development in that leadership space. So if I can go back to what we talked about at the start of the podcast, that you're part of the 2020 finalists for the program that's being run through the Future Leaders program is it out of Canberra or Melbourne?
I believe that AgriFutures is based in Wagga, I believe.
Oh, okay, great. So we're talking New South Wales here. So and that's fine. So that in some ways, that's a way to do some professional development for you. Have you done anything else in your studies to help with your professional development? And I guess I would use, in an informal way, your studies that have helped you to develop as a person, as a researcher, as someone who's contributing to that knowledge base. But have you sought to do anything else beyond those things, or have you had opportunities? Have you taken opportunities to do anything else in that sort of development space for yourself?
Yes and no. So a lot of my focus was on my studies. So especially, doing the PhD was very busy just doing the research. But I absolutely still do. I'd go just through the university. They'd have all sorts of workshops that I'd go along to if it had any relevance to me. I've done them very eclectic. So I've done one on like upskilling for management. I once did it was mentors in violence prevention. I've done the mental health first aid youth course. I was with the state emergency service as a volunteer for a while. So through that, I did a whole swag of different courses. And then just recently, I'm doing an online introduction to project management to, build up some of the, understanding and skills on the, strictly project side of things. So basically, I like to learn new things and new skills, and very open to doing kind of professional development around that. But I guess doing my research was fulfilling that for a very long time in my undergrad studies before that. Certainly have future professional development that I'd love to do as well. I'd love to do an entire project management course and also a governance course. Maybe even one day the Australian Rural Leadership Program would be really, really great.
Oh, okay, yeah. That's not a bad thing to aim for. It's I haven't done that program myself, but I keep hearing very good things about it. In fact, one of the podcast guests I had was Matt Liniger, who is the CEO of the Australian Rural Leadership Program. So, I think it's well worth considering that. It's fairly intensive and fairly full on. But if that's one of your goals, that's really a good thing to be aiming for. So again, you've got kind of answered my next question, but not. But and that's okay. I get some of you people when I do these podcasts that jump ahead on me, but that's all right. Do you have a view on lifelong learning? So, and before you answer, I get the sense that you want to do as much as you can to get your skills sets up, and I couldn't be more of an advocate for that. Had I to do it again, so I've got 20 years on you, mate. If I could go back and do it again, I would do a lot more PD early on to get some of those things out of the way. So, but let's not look at this as the here and now type lifelong learning, like into the future. Do you think you'll be, as a matter of course, be doing things to help develop yourself as a professional, or do you think there's a time when that has to stop and it's just being immersed in the work that you're doing? And I haven't, again, and I thank you for this podcast. It's got me thinking about 100 different things here, but one of the things that's a good thing to explore is there an end point to lifelong learning, or is it something that is always sort of bubbling away in the background?
I think you're right in that it's always bubbling away in the background. So you probably guessed that I'm big, pro lifelong learning. Absolutely, it's vital. And I don't think it ever does stop, because times do change every day. So there's going to be new things to learn, even if it's just adapting what you've already got to that new situation. There's going to be learning moments in that. Absolutely. So I think lifelong learning doesn't stop, and that can be, on the job, personal, professional, whether, studies or, as I said, on the job. So absolutely, lots of different ways we can learn, and we should continue to learn throughout our lives.
And that's great. I think it's for me, you're always trying to learn something new, and in the throes of doing studies, you sometimes forget that you're signed up to this thing about lifelong learning, because I never thought I'd get to the position where I'm in the throes of finishing some postgraduate studies. And for those that might be listening, if you've got that in mind, always consider going. You can always go back to do more studies, and there's always opportunities to upskill yourself. And for me, it's picking an area that you have a very keen interest in. Otherwise, it's just not worth doing. So if you take the school model out of the equation, where you had to do things that you might not necessarily have ever understood why you needed to do them as a professional going down the track, being able to spot some things that can help your career is quite a good thing. So Caitlin, the next area of questions I've got is around leadership models. So you mentioned very briefly, and I think you'll come back to it after I ask a question around mentors. Do you have a mentor through your studies? And that could be either the supervisor or someone else. So I'm curious to know, did you set anything up formal, or was it an informal network that you might have had when you were pursuing your studies?
So there was absolutely, my supervisor was definitely had that kind of mentorship role. I also had another PhD student. She was a couple years ahead of me. She's actually also in the agricultural space, but slightly different, who very informal, like I count her as a friend, as well as having that mentorship aspect. She was really great. If I had questions, she'd just, answer me, and she had that direct experience, also having done her PhD in that ag space with, ag people. So absolutely, mentorship, I think, is really helpful. And I guess that's something I would certainly love to get some more mentors in kind of different areas to help, I guess, open my eyes to areas that I'm not so aware of. Because something I always would say to my students, funnily enough, is that often we're not aware of what we're not aware of. So, you know, the whole imposter syndrome, Dunning-Kruger effect is where, as you know, we're not aware of our level of competence in an area, particularly when we have low competence, because we have almost an ignorance of it, even if it's not purposeful.
Yeah, sure. And that you know, as an addition to that, I guess when you talk about you don't know what you don't know, yeah, I think mentors can fill a space there and help you sort of identify and get out of your comfort zone and maybe teach you something or give you some life lessons that you might not normally get from your day-to-day travels in whatever role you're fulfilling at that time. So were these mentors you had, was it more an informal type thing, or did you pursue formal mentoring relationships?
So I was actually given a more formalized mentor as part of the Avoca program. So it was only fairly recently. So I have emails with her. I haven't spoken to her yet. She's been off gallivanting the world. So I'm really excited for that. Funnily enough, she has the friend of mine that was the more informal mentor role also knows her. So that's pretty cool. And so that's something. And then I'm still waiting on if there's a few mentorship programs that I'm waiting, like they've been kind of soft announced, but not officially announced, that I'd really love to have a part of, you know, when they are announced and open.
Sure. No, that's great. So final question for this podcast, Caitlin. I'd love to get your perspective on this particular statement. Leaders are born, not made.
When I saw the thing you'd given me, first thing I thought of, nature versus nurture debate. So big in psychology and, you know, hotly debated for years. And the conclusion was that it's both. So I definitely think there are people who have like their natural capability, like they start kind of a higher baseline is one way, I guess, to say it. So they have that natural capability. But then absolutely people can develop the skills and capabilities through their experiences, whether it's, you know, adversity or just learning and passion and drive. So I think there's aspects where you might start, but there's a knowledge and, you know, capabilities aspects that are both needed. And I do think they can be developed, but some people probably start at a higher baseline.
No, that's excellent. So, Caitlin, I do appreciate your time and thank you for your insightful answers to these questions. And you've really thrown me a little bit and in a good way for future podcasts around this leadership issue. It's not just something that's within formal organisations. You can have leadership in the university context, in the sporting arena, and these are areas that I've been thinking about a little while to get more into to get people's insights, because, you know, and I've dealt with a lot of good people in the academic field, particularly after I graduated. So in my undergraduate studies, I met some academics that I didn't have a lot of time for, but I didn't, as a young bloke, I didn't really understand some of the pressures that they are under and some of the idiosyncrasies that comes up with working in a university context. And I don't care what people say, universities are big bureaucracies like anywhere else, and
absolutely
they have their own issues that need to be dealt with. Not that I'm going to be dealing with them, but as someone who and my supervisor, Dr. Luke Vanderland, he's been quite good at helping me orient to that particular world and the ins and outs of what it means to be an academic versus to be out there and being a practitioner out in the field doing what I want to do in the future. So it's really important to get yourself understanding, particularly in this topic around leadership, that it is a lot bigger than just the organizational context. And, in the future, I want to be interviewing emerging leaders in the volunteer sector, in the not-for-profit space. I'm not talking industry advocacy, but something like migrant services, areas where you're helping people that isn't necessarily about the profit motive being the driver of what you do, the things you do and what you do in the context of leadership. So it is a lot bigger than I had been thinking about, and this is helpful for me because as you're helping me and others are helping me to build the content on this podcast, it will become a lot more apparent that this issue around leadership is a lot more nuanced than most people give it credit for. So I appreciate your time, Caitlin. Thank you very much.
I appreciate being here, and I really, to make a quick comment on your last point there is, I would really like to get out there that, coming from academia doesn't mean we don't live in the real world. So we have, something to offer.
Yeah, and I firmly believe that. So for the podcast listeners, this has been Eric Perez with Caitlin Vayro joining me today. Thank you again, Caitlin.
Thanks.
And I'll catch everyone on the next podcast.